Well, hello everyone. Um, we're very fortunate to have someone so noted in the area of international studies, especially in the Middle East, Professor Stephen Zunes, on our, despite the fact that it's our national holiday. Um, and anyway, um, so Professor Zunes is the director of programs on Middle East studies at University of San Francisco. He's someone I think many of you have heard or uh, read his works. We've had him as a speaker in the Suds Snacks and Socialism series, which we co-sponsor, and we're very fortunate to have him today. He's uh, someone who has written uh, a very well-known book, Tinderbox: U.S. Middle East Policy, um, and Roots of pardon me, and the Roots of Terrorism. And he's someone who certainly is going to inform us of the difficulties that we're facing now in the midst of this new administration, and not just what we've been through in terms and what the Palestinian people have been through in terms of what's been happening in Gaza, but the whole regional situation that we're facing. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Zunes.
Thank you. Um, I'll be looking at a couple of themes here. While it may have seemed that a second Trump administration couldn't possibly enact policies toward Israel and Palestine that were any worse than those of the Biden administration, early signs indicate that indeed it is. And I'm going to be looking at both of these, both that Biden's policies were very extreme. I mean, not just from kind of a left perspective, but even a kind of a mainstream liberal perspective. Biden was, had U.S. policy well to the right of the vast majority of American public opinion, the vast majority of world opinion. Um, but also that again, Trump is taking it to a whole new level of outrageousness and extremism. But I will also go back to the theme that the extreme right-wing nature of Trump's foreign policy agenda may open the door to finally challenging U.S. policy towards the conflict, or at least force establishment Democrats to reckon with the potential consequences of failing to oppose him on this issue. Under Biden, the United States was an international outlier in its support for Israel's devastating war on the civilian population of Gaza. He refused to apply the considerable leverage that the United States has on the Israeli government to end the slaughter of civilians in Gaza, or to condition military aid to Israel on Israel ending its illegal occupation of the West Bank and allowing for the emergence of a Palestinian state. Um, Biden repeatedly blocked efforts by the United Nations to impose a ceasefire and vetoed um, four resolutions on that, plus an otherwise unanimous resolution recognizing Palestine, while totally and while dismissing the United Nations support for a two-state solution, insisting that a Palestinian state could only emerge on terms to which Israel would voluntarily agree, even though Israel's totally ruled out categorically that would allow any kind of Palestinian state to emerge. Um, Biden upheld four of Trump's controversial initiatives during his first term, recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights, which the UN Security Council had unanimously declared to be null and void. Secondly, maintaining the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, making the U.S. the only major country to do so. Third was refusing to reopen the U.S. consulate in occupied East Jerusalem, which had existed since the 1930s. and finally refusing to allow the Palestinian diplomatic offices in Washington to reopen. And he even spoke out against nonviolent civil society movements against the occupation, denouncing calls for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. Now, in his final year of his term, Biden took a few modest actions to limit Israeli violence against Palestinian civilians. And in May of last year, he delayed shipment of 3,500 bombs, including 2,000-pound unguided bunker busters that the Israeli military was using to blow up entire apartment blocks in Gaza. And in November, he issued sanctions such as freezing assets against 9 far-right settler militias and their organizations, which have terrorized Palestinians in the West Bank with shootings, arson, and other attacks. Um, but Biden's actions did little to curb the settler violence. More than 1,400 settler attacks took place in the 11 months after he first imposed the sanctions, and he refused to condition military aid to the Israeli armed forces, which had openly collaborated with the settler militias on stopping the terrorism. In a way, this is kind of like Reagan's approach to the Salvadoran Civil War, where the administrations condemned the far-right death squads and denied visas to some of their leaders while enabling further killings by insisting on continued U.S. support for the death squad Salvadoran military backers. And similarly, you know, Biden allowed, for hundreds of thousands of other bombs and missiles and things to fall. It did very little to curb the violence there. But despite all this, now I'll be looking at some of these in a little more detail. Trump is obviously going to a whole nother level. He ended up releasing those bunker buster bombs and the others that Biden had held up, and he lifted the sanctions against the far right settler militia leaders. And of course, this past Tuesday, in a joint press conference with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Trump announced that the United States will take over the Gaza Strip, level the site, and have all Palestinians removed, and enable foreigners to build, what he appeared to envision as an international resort area. I mean, this is on the one hand, this is the most extreme anti-Palestinian statements to have ever come out of Washington, at least by a president. But it, in many ways, is the logical extension of decades of bipartisan U.S. policy supporting the Israeli occupation and colonization of the West Bank, its illegal annexation of the Golan, its declaration of Jerusalem as Israel's exclusive capital, and the decades-long siege and support for the decades-long siege and successive devastating wars on the Gaza Strip. So, in denying Palestinians equal rights, either as part of a viable two-state solution or as a binational state with guaranteed equal rights for all, the United States has contributed to the emergence of the violent extremists on both sides and has given the far more powerful Israelis license to once again engage in ethnic cleansing. Indeed, Trump's rationalization for the expulsion of Palestinians, the rebuilding of Gaza on U.S. terms, was based on his observation that the largely urban enclave had been reduced to rubble and that could no longer sustain such a large population. Now, he blamed the Palestinians' bad luck, but it was, in fact, a result of deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure by U.S.-backed Israeli forces in a manner that a growing international legal consensus is found to be a form of genocide. The genocide made possible through the bipartisan support for unconditional military aid, and again, these U.S. vetoes and attacks on human rights groups and international legal institutions seeking accountability. Um, the and and indeed, I want to talk a little, but again, we need to look at this in part as in part of a kind of a broader understanding of U.S. Foreign policy. I think there's a lot of people, especially younger activists, like my students, for whom this is their first major, struggle about atrocities by U.S.-backed allies. Most people on this on this meeting it is not their first, certainly not mine. But I think by the fact we have this history, we should understand that this is not the first genocide. the U.S. has supported. I mean, we can look at a whole number of them. In Bangladesh, 1971, and Nixon supporting Pakistani dictator Yahya Khan and the horrific massacre of hundreds of thousands of Bengalis, particularly Bengali Hindus, but the Bengalis as a whole. Um, we think of the um, U.S. Support, for uh, Rios Montt regime in Guatemala, 1981 through 83, the genocide against the indigenous people in the highlands, over 100,000 people slaughtered. We could look at East Timor, Indonesia's brutal occupation of that island nation. Close to 200,000 people, a third of that island state's population died, and successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, supported unconditional military aid and opposed the UN, taking any kind of actions. We could even consider, Turkey's offensive against the Kurds in the 1990s, or Saudi Arabia's terror bombing of Yemen. In recent years. I mean, these could also be argued were genocidal in terms of the that they were deliberately targeting the civilian populations in ways to make life unlivable, and kill people with impunity. And putting this and the other aspects of U.S. support for Israel in a broader context of U.S. imperialism is very important, because a lot of people think, oh, it must be the powerful Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, that kind of forces politicians to take these extreme measures. And there's no question that AIPAC and these other right-wing Zionist groups have made it more difficult to challenge U.S. policy in terms of censoring speakers and pressuring the media and the coverage, and and all sorts of, and we can go down the list. I can certainly think of all the times that I've had talks canceled, and the pressure on me, etc. But this idea that some people claim that, oh, if it weren't for the Zionist lobby, somehow the United States would suddenly be concerned about human rights and international law in the Middle East, and we'd stop supporting a right-wing ally and engaging in war crimes and in human rights abuses and violations of international legal norms. Don't be silly. I mean, when has the United States taken consistent views, support for international law and human rights any part of the world? Okay, so again, so again, I'm not denying that the Zionist lobby has some clout, but we got to really, again, in terms of limiting debate, but let's not kid ourselves. The thrust of U.S. foreign policy would essentially, be the same, even if it weren't for AIPAC and the like. The But I mean, I think it's important uh, to look at how the and when we think of Biden's policies. Again, many of you seem to have been around long enough to remember the Reagan administration, and remember how in El Salvador the Reagan administration repeatedly covered up for atrocities, and insisting that the El Mozote massacre, in which over 800 peasants were slaughtered, never happened. And following the rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen by Salvadoran soldiers, Reagan administration officials defended the regime by claiming these nuns were not just nuns, they were political activists, and they tried to run a roadblock and were killed in a shootout. And when the Salvadoran forces murdered 6 Jesuit priests at the Central America University, along with their housekeeper and daughter, the administration tried to claim it was actually carried out by leftist guerrillas. And similarly, Biden has denied the casualty figures by the Palestinian Health Ministry, saying they were exaggerated, even though it now appears they've been gross underestimates. He falsely claimed that the civilian casualties were a result of Hamas using human shields, despite the absence of evidence, the widespread use of civilians by Hamas in such manner, the fact that the vast majority of civilian casualties have occurred far from Hamas military operations. And Biden's administration repeatedly denied that Israel, despite considerable evidence, is violating international humanitarian law. Again, very similar to Reagan. And similarly, we may remember Reagan routinely attacked reports by Amnesty International, America's Watch, and other groups of widespread killing of civilians by U.S.-backed forces in Central America. And the Biden administration has shown similar hostility towards Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, other human rights groups, including B'Tselem, which is Israel's leading human rights organization. I mean, the when the Amnesty International report accused Israel of apartheid, the U.S. ambassador to Israel claimed it was absurd. The State Department spokesman roundly rejected the report's conditions, saying the Jewish people must not be denied their right of self-determination, even though there was nothing in the report questioning that. And both administrations categorically ruled out conditioning military aid to their repressive allies, despite polls showing the vast majority of Americans oppose such unconditional arms transfers. And neither administration tolerated involvement by the United Nations or the international judiciary. The Reagan administration vetoed otherwise unanimous UN Security Council resolutions opposing its attacks in Nicaragua and its invasion of Grenada. And similarly, the Biden administration, as I mentioned, vetoed 4 otherwise unanimous UN Security Council resolutions trying to impose a ceasefire in the Gaza war. Similarly, both administrations attacked the International Court of Justice when it tried to uphold international legal standards. When Mrs. Reagan attacked the World Court for ruling that U.S. attacks on Nicaragua, such as mining Nicaraguan harbors, bombing oil depots, backing the Contras, was contrary to international law. Biden has pushed back against the World Court regarding its rulings on the illegality of the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and likely violations of the genocide treaty in Gaza. And again, both administrations have also been prone to engage in gross exaggerations of wrongdoing by their opponents. I mean, Reagan defended backing the murderous Salvadoran army by insisting that the popular resistance movement in El Salvador were terrorists, and he defended support for the Contras, who are attacking civilian targets alongside the Honduran border, by claiming the leftist Sandinista government had supposedly turned their country into a totalitarian dungeon and were committing genocide against the Mosquito Indians. Similarly, Biden has defended his support for Israeli war crimes by falsely claiming that Hamas, in addition to the very real atrocities that took place in October 2023, but claiming they had beheaded babies during their attacks. Not true. He falsely claimed that Al-Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest, which was attacked and largely destroyed by Israel, was actually a Hamas military command center. I mean, again, both administrations, were willing to make things up, frankly, and both administrations denied agency to those forces their allies were fighting, apparently believing they'd have more success in defending a controversial foreign policy if seen as part of a wider geopolitical struggle against a repressive regime with expansionist ambition. So the Reagan administration insisted the Sandinista, the government in Nicaragua, and the FMLN guerrillas in El Salvador were simply proxies of the Soviet Union, while Biden officials claimed that Hamas was an Iranian proxy. And just as the vast majority of Latin American scholars, 90 plus 5% or whatever, opposed Reagan's policies, a similarly large majority of Middle East scholars have opposed Biden's policies. Even in the State Department, the majority of relevant area specialists objected to these administration's positions. However, both Reagan and Biden demonstrated disregard for those knowledgeable of the nations in question, insisting they somehow knew better. Now, the major difference between the Reagan and Biden administrations with regard to foreign affairs is that most congressional Democrats opposed Reagan's Central America policies, while the vast majority of Democrats in Congress have supported Biden's policies, despite opposition from a huge majority of Democratic voters nationwide. And though Americans overall appear to still support human rights international law, the leadership of both political parties have moved to the right since the 1980s, which has given the Trump administration considerable leeway to further undermine human rights, international legal institutions. I mean, I think just to give an example of just how extreme things have gone. The Biden administration and bipartisan leaders of Congress have launched a full-scale attack against the integrity of the International Criminal Court in response to its indictments in November of, um, of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and along with a Hamas military commander who since found out was killed, Mohammed Diaf. In fact, they recommended two other Hamas leaders be prosecuted, but they were assassinated as before the formal indictments had come down. Now, the ICC has indicted 67 individuals since its founding in 2002. This marked the first time the organization has ever indicted members of a U.S. ally. And not surprising, the first time the U.S. government has disagreed with its official moves to prosecute war criminals. I mean, the amazing, I mean, the Trump's announcement about wanting to annex Gaza got a lot of the media attention, but the very fact that he was standing, that an indicted war criminal who is wanted in 125 countries could even come to the United States and be feted and treated that way instead of being arrested and extradited to The Hague. And yet, you have this. I mean, this is seen as almost a normal. I mean, the ICC comes out saying it has reasonable grounds to believe that Netanyahu and Gallant are criminally responsible for crimes against humanity, including murder and persecution, and the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare. But Biden described the internationally supported effort to hold them into account for these war crimes as outrageous. Again, it's the first time a sitting president has openly sided with war criminals against the ICC. And this is again contrast to the reaction of almost every other country in the world. And Biden tried to misrepresent things. Whatever the ICC might imply, there's no equivalence, none between Israel and Hamas. But the ICC charged Diaf and the Israeli leaders with separate crimes, citing specific and distinct wrongful conduct by each. Indeed, Diaf was charged with more serious crimes, including extermination, torture, rape, other forms of sexual violence. And yet, and they even claimed the ICC has no jurisdiction to indict Israeli leaders because Israel isn't a party to the Rome Statute, the 1998 treaty that established the ICC. But it welcomed the ICC's indictments of Putin and 6 other Russians last year for war crimes related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, despite the fact that neither Russia nor Ukraine are parties to the Rome Statute. And the state of Palestine did accede to the Rome Statute, which gives the ICC the authority to prosecute parties who commit crimes on or from Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip. But I mean, there's the extreme. I mean, it's amazing how Biden has insisted that this broad consensus of the top human rights lawyers and international jurists, and these are the people who have chaired, who've done investigations in war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sudan. I mean, they're not, the idea that have some kind of bias against Israel is nonsense. But basically, what Biden and now Trump, who has, laterally sanctioned these top jurists and investigators and human rights lawyers, is that international humanitarian law should be based not on objective, not on the evidence about the crimes or the severity of the crimes, but that only based on the geopolitical orientation of the country that the indicted people are from, and Biden finished. Biden graduated in the bottom 10th of his class in law school at Syracuse University, and he has the audacity, to, go after the to attack, these preeminent um, human rights lawyers. And again, this is now. I could go on for literally for hours, and if you want to uh, get copies of my articles where I have detailed just how extreme and how much of an international outlier the United States is, you can email me, and I will send you the articles and put you on my email list, or just put my email address in the chat just now. But what I'm trying to um, convey here is that um, the United States position, whether it be recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of occupied territory, whether it be rationalizing for war crimes, questioning the authority of international jurists, international legal institutions, and even tolerating the colonization of occupied territories and the like. I mean, this is an attack basically against the foundations of the post-World War II international legal order. Like the invasion of Iraq, it is basically the United States is an international outlier saying the rules do not apply to us or our allies. Now, back in my radical student days in the 1970s, I really never thought I'd be here in the year 2025 fighting what may be a losing battle simply to save the liberalism of my parents' generation. But this is essentially is what we're dealing with right here. That yeah, if you ask my attitudes about capitalism and patriarchy and militarism, yeah, I'm pretty far left. But I'm simply talking about, again, basic liberal values. Nothing pretty radical here. I mean, I'm not talking about being anti-Zionist. I'm not talking about, we're just talking about the basic rules of how governments should deal with each other that we thought we had a consensus on back in 1945. But we have a bipartisan majority that is saying no, not necessarily. If our ally wants to violate these norms and it's in our strategic interest to help them do it, we'll let them do it. And in certain ways, I mean, we talk about how Trump, feels like the law doesn't, Trump, everybody's afraid about Trump, you know, using the law against to go after political opponents, and then to exonerate and let his people get away with all sorts of law breaking. Well, this is what the United States has been doing internationally for years, with the support of both parties. Now, again, I could go on for a long time; it'd be pretty depressing. But I want to finish by looking at the hopeful sign. And the one thing about having Trump doing the things he's doing on Israel-Palestine is it's not subtle. It is pretty obvious what it's about. In many ways, I mean, the Democrats would give lip service to a viable two-state solution when it was very clear they were not willing to pressure Israel to make that at all possible. But Trump, he's openly talking about ethnic cleansing. Will very likely recognize Israel annexation of the West Bank. And it's clear that this is not about the lobby. This is about imperialism, about racism, about settler colonialism. I mean, it's hard. I mean, when I was growing up, Israel was the darling of the liberal intelligentsia. Now it's the darling of the Christian right. Israel was seen, as a democracy, struggling against the Arab hordes. Now it's very clear, to virtually anybody, that they are the Goliath. I mean, they're the occupier, they're the oppressor. There's etc. And I think that, and this says a lot about the huge shift in political attitude towards Israel-Palestine between my generation and today's youth. I mean, when I started teaching Middle East policy 40 years ago, I had to bend over backwards to make sure my students knew the Palestinian narrative, because I assumed they all knew and supported the Israeli narrative. If anything, it's the other way around now. I mean, seriously, there's no issue, even LGBTQ rights, where there's such a straight line between political attitude and age, because they've never bought into that kind of idealistic Paul Newman and Exodus, the plucky kibbutzniks, the struggling, the social democracy, Sweden of the Middle East, and et cetera, et cetera. They've only seen Israel under far right leadership, where the racism is so much more overt. And and they are more diverse ethnically, religiously than our generation. They were also very much they don't get their media, the news, through the filter of mainstream media. They can see on their cell phones the horror that's going on in Gaza. And so the Zionist left has largely disappeared. And so this is we're really seeing a shift here. Now, what does it mean about U.S. policy? We can't wait till the younger generation becomes the rulers. Too many people are going to die in the meantime. But what gives me hope is a couple things. First of all, again, those of you who have the memory can look back to 1969, when all these Democrats on Capitol Hill who refused to speak up against Johnson's policy in Vietnam, when a Democrat was in office, suddenly switched and became opposed to the war when it was being prosecuted by Nixon, a Republican. So this might give some liberal Democrats the space to speak out and challenge them. It also gives us an opening. Again, I showed how 80% of Democratic-leaning voters oppose any military aid to Israel. So if a member of Congress votes for Trump's aid to Israel, you say he or she is a pro-Trump member of Congress. They're supporting Trump over 80% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning voters. We can make this the one. Do you support? Whose side? Which side are you on? It'll be a much clearer kind of case around this. And again, I think you'll make it clear this is not about the Israel lobby. This is an overtly racist president who supports overtly racist policies. And the whole rationalization for what Israel is doing and U.S. support for it is indeed rooted in racism. And people get all defensive if you accuse Biden of racism. But it's almost a given when it comes to Trump. So that, again, is something that gives us much more political space to make U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine a more mainstream peace issue, a more mainstream human rights issue. And I think, and the more we do that, I think the greater the alliances. Now, again, I'm certainly not a Zionist, but I don't think that just harboring on Zionism is going to really build a big coalition as we need. I think we do need to talk to, again, embrace some of these basic values, the concerns about human rights that were so powerful and ultimately changing U.S. policy around Vietnam, around Central America, around South Africa, around East Timor, going back to Vietnam. And so I do think that we may indeed have an opening here. Now, there's so much more I could say, but I think maybe I should just throw it up to any questions and feedback people want to share.
Hi, I'm Justin. I'm going to help keep Stack here, and I see a hand, Bill Balderston, and anyone else who wants to get on Stack, please raise your hand. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Professor Zunes, for a really inspiring presentation, especially for those of us old enough to remember the kinds of movements that developed nationally and internationally, obviously around Vietnam, but also Central America, South Africa. And Um, Also, because I think for so many of us, it even if we've been consistently opposed to the Israeli regime, uh, we can never imagine the kind of breadth of opposition that's developed, including in the labor movement, of which I'm very active. But I have a geopolitical question, which is it seems to me that for so long, the centerpiece for so much of U.S. policy has been to try to reach, some kind of regional accord with the various authoritarian regimes in the area. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is one of the centerpieces. And yet, what's happening now seems to be running, although Trump may try to, hold out prospects of real estate profits, uh, to run totally counter to the ability to reach that accord. Um, and so it's hard to know where they're going with this, at least
Yeah.
on that.
Thank you for raising that, because I think, again, a positive thing is that this is going to make that totally impossible. I mean, the overreach is extreme. Trump thinks this is a real estate deal, and you can just pressure people. But even these ultra authoritarian family dictatorships in the Gulf, they can't make peace with Israel without addressing the Palestinian question. When 98% of their people would oppose it, I mean, they are. They may be authoritarian, but they can't go that far in terms of contrary to public opinion. So yeah, I no regional agreement's going to really come. I don't. What was disgusting though was that the Biden administration, even the Democratic Party platform, seemed to support the so-called Abraham Accords. 94% of Middle East scholars said it did not enhance peace. In fact, it did just the opposite. But they're acting like it was a great thing, including the fact that the U.S. formally recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara. Full member state of the African Union. It's recognized by over 80 countries. And if you look on all these maps, you'll see, you know, either Western Sahara is a separate state, or it'll be in hash marks or a dotted line or something like that, showing it's, occupied territory. But under Biden, all U.S. government maps showed it as one country, no demarcation whatsoever, all Morocco. And so here he said, let's send hundreds of billions of dollars to support the Ukrainians, because no country can expand its territory by force. No country can unilaterally shift international boundaries. Yet we support Israel and Morocco doing the exact same thing that Russia's doing. And so but again, the thing with Trump is that it's so flagrant. It is that again, it's going to be very hard, for it, even our closest Middle Eastern allies to go along with what he's doing.
James McFadden, go ahead. I see your hand.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. It seems to me there's a symbiotic relationship between Israel and the U.S. ruling class, and it's like a relationship between crime syndicates is the way I think of it. They got their made men. Israel's our made man, and we collaborate to destroy any threats to our syndicate. And or Israel's our hitman, and the U.S. is the crime boss who pays him to provide syndicate
Yeah.
protection. And so I'm interested in why the U.S. ruling class behaves in this way, the psychology and motivation. And by that I mean I think I understand the sociopathic behavior of national security managers because I read a book called The Roots of War by Richard Barnett, and that really
Oh, yeah.
outlined that. But I'm wondering about, in a capitalist systems, the neocon should not be in charge. It should be the capitalist class. And so where are the capitalists seeing their interests being protected with the isolation the U.S. is experiencing is continuing to grow? And do you think the capitalists fail to recognize this, or are they
But
just planning to extract as much as possible before, things
yeah,
really?
yeah. As you know, the ruling class can very often look more at the short term and not the long term. in the short term, credible military contracts from Israel. I mean, we're we talk about U.S. aid to Israel. People saying, well, billions and billions of dollars to Israel, and they got to have, universal health care and affordable college education and all these things we don't. It's not fair. Well, the fact is that 85% of U.S. aid to Israel goes to American arms manufacturers, and often includes things they don't even Israelis necessarily want. I talked to a top procurement officer for the Israeli Defense Forces, and he said, half the stuff we get is just kept the assembly lines running at McDonnell Douglas and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin or whatever. Not even stuff we necessarily want or need. So I mean, there's the profits from that. Also, remember the high tech industries of Israel and the United States are very, very tightly. So all these tech bros, very close ties to Israel. And there's the military industrial complexes of the two countries are very, very closely intertwined. The Mossad and the CIA collaborate in intelligence gathering, covert operations. Israel's sent arms to third parties. The U.S. That supports U.S. objectives, including those that we can't give to directly, for political purposes. Like if you look back to Iran-Contra, you look back at U.S. Israeli support for the Contras, Guatemalan junta, South Africa's apartheid regime, and the like. More recently, Israel supported Colombian paramilitaries and various armed Kurdish groups. So and it's they're very much our cat's paw, our surrogate, and unlike our Arab allies who could be overthrown in a coup or revolution, Israel's there to stay. They're an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as one former U.S. Secretary of State said, and Biden repeatedly said, if it weren't for Israel, we'd have to invent them because of what they do for us. So it's very important we don't fall into the tail wagging the dog narrative. Again, this idea that, we'd have a more rational policy, far-sighted policy, if it weren't for the Zionist forcing us to do this. Because in its more extreme form, that narrative actually falls into these old anti-Semitic tropes. It's not the real ruling class of America, which is, 96% Gentile. That I mean that's leading us in this terrible direction. It's that cabal of rich and powerful Jews that are making us do this. And so we got to be real careful, not to exaggerate the power of AIPAC and the power of Jewish Zionist entities that are. I mean, they. The Israel lobby is only as powerful as it corresponds with overall U.S. interests. Because every time a president has decided to go against AIPAC, they've won. Eisenhower in the Suez Crisis, Carter in the first Israel invasion of Lebanon, Reagan in the AWACS deal with Saudi Arabia, Obama in the nuclear deal, Senior George Bush and the loan guarantees. I mean, all these things, the president has always won. And similarly, when people act like Biden was somehow helpless to stop the war, Carter, Reagan, and Obama all stopped Israeli wars by threatening to withhold aid. We do have that power. So I'm really so Israel is seen very much as an asset. Now in the longer term, it hurts U.S. interest because it's turning billions of more Muslims against us. It underscores it weakens our arguments against Russian aggression in Ukraine. It weakens our arguments about non-proliferation. We support Israel's nukes, but threaten to go to war with Iran. I mean, and obviously on human rights concerns. So there are a lot of there are realists within the foreign policy establishment that are questioning, and John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt are two big examples of that. Though again, they go too far by blaming the lobby because obviously, as people who are in the foreign policy establishment, they won't critically look at imperialism. They'll try to blame it on the Zionists or whatever. But there are cracks in the system. There are those. In fact, any rational realist would say no. In the long term, this actually hurts U.S. strategic interests. But we know the capitalist class is always going to look at the short-term gains and not look at the longer-term implications.
Thanks on that.
Ariane, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Zunes, for your scholarship and your compassion. I have a few remarks, and they're sort of entangled with questions. I hope they're clear and valuable to you. I think that the U.S. uses Israel as a military base, and I also think that the Pentagon is much stronger than the executive branch. And so it's strategic. They don't want people to realize, there's sort of like a dance, a cover up. But what concerns me with American people is that when there was the massive protest movement during the Vietnam War, people were concerned. They had a self-oriented concern, which was about not being drafted and killed in Vietnam. I mean, to a lesser extent, we saw there were big protests, but not sustained against the war in Iraq. There were 1 or 2 million people out for a weekend or two, but it wasn't like the Vietnam War where there were protests over time. My concern now is that Americans are very complacent and they don't understand how we're implicated, how everything is interdependent, and that the whole thing could blow up in a world war, and that the Pentagon and their people strategically who are trying to push the world into that from our nation principally. So that's the first comment. I would like your thoughts on it. And the second comment or question would be, well, why don't you answer that first, and then I'll...
Yeah, I think just the thing is that Central America and even East Timor examples are of where Americans weren't coming home in body bags, but just people were morally appalled at what was going on to make a difference. And U.S. support for the apartheid regime in South Africa and their occupation in Namibia, and those grassroots movements that made a shift. So you don't have to have your be concerned about being personally killed, to mobilize and to and to make a difference. And I think people can be mobilized simply by that just morally. It's totally unjustifiable for the U.S. to support a genocide or an occupation or colonization or expanding territory by force or anything like that.
Yeah, but I'm talking about what is effective. I think we agree that many Americans know that this is a blight, immoral and criminal intervention. I'm actually talking about tactics and strategies. So the next question.
Anything. I mean, I when people talk about strategies and tactics and what should we do, I tell people that back in my 20s, I could tell you exactly what to do. Now I'm not so sure. But
yeah, but can I give you some feedback? I'd like to just venture this, and
sure.
I say this out of the greatest respect. This is the Green Party. I'm not so involved in this. I live in San Francisco, but I've heard you many times on the radio, and I have great respect for you, which drew me here today because I have like 5 meetings on Sundays, but I did make the time for it. I think one area that there could be more efficacy would be the intersection of the environmental movement and militarism, because we know that, for instance, America's military emits 5% of all greenhouse gases worldwide.
Emitter in the world.
Yeah, and so even though the Pentagon is a criminal element, I think that you could get more young people involved if you were personally, when you lecture, whether on the radio or here or elsewhere, and for us too, we're activists, to make connections between this existential issue, which is the environmental degradation, and the fact that all of humanity is living on the lip of extinction, and militarism, in this case, the genocide of the Gazans. Does that seem like
No,
that?
no, I've been saying that myself for some time, and also just, of course, making the linkage between, the unaffordability of healthcare and higher education and our crisis in infrastructure and housing and public transit and things like that, and how much we waste on the Pentagon. I mean, I had my sabbatical year in Sweden last year, and obviously, there are many of my colleagues would critique Sweden's system from the left, but compared to what we have, social democracy looks great. So,
but there are the
but
forces that don't want a good educational system. They don't want fair housing.
yeah, I know. There's
The
there are
same
elements there,
thing.
but I think basically let's
The strategy and the
okay, in terms of tactics, strategy, and tactics, always needs to be a mix, and depends on where you are personally moved. Some people really believe that working in the left wing of the Democratic Party is the way to go. So some people believe put your body in the line, nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, shut stuff down. There are people who work within the religious community. There are people who work, make the links with environmentalists. There are those who do letter writing, visuals, demonstrate. I mean, there are many things that people can do, but the critical thing is to what's the new phase we are in Israel Palestine now is that we don't have to convince people that what Israel's doing is wrong and U.S. support for Israel is wrong. We finally have majority of the American people agreeing with us. And now we know from past struggles, Vietnam, Central America, anything else, there's a lag time between the majority of the American people believing things and a shift in policy. And that's true of just about everything, but particularly foreign policy. Because you are up against the so-called blob of the foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial complex and all the things that help prop it up. But we're finally in the majority now, thanks to Netanyahu and Biden and the horror in Gaza, and so I think we can just escalate all those tactics, and I think we'll indeed see some real change. And again, with Trump in there, again, they can't. It's almost impossible to rationalize for stuff anymore.
James, I see your hand. Go ahead again, since there's no one else on stack.
Thanks. I'm interested. I'm always interested in trying to learn a little bit more, and I like to read, and so I'm always looking for good books. And so, in terms of like Palestine, I've read my book club read Ilan Pappé's History of Modern Palestine recently, which gave me a lot of good information. And if I want to learn about Africa, there's Walter Rodney. Latin America, there's Galliano. I was wondering, just from what are some books that you would recommend to people that just want to get informed about?
Rashid Khaldi's review of the history, I think it's called 100 Years' War, something like that, is probably the best historical overview. Yeah, and Muzin Kamsea's book about the history of the Palestinian struggle that goes back the civil resistance and the like that goes back 100 years or more. This is those are the two I'd recommend the most.
Yeah, I have the 100 Years on my shelf. I just haven't got to it. No, thanks.
Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about Syria. I read somewhere recent that Israel is now building bases in parts of the Syrian territory that they took over.
Yeah. Syria,
And
Israel's occupied the Golan over half the Golan province since 1967. They formally annexed it in 1981. Which the UN Security Council unanimously said was illegal, null and void. You can't expand your territory by force. Trump reversed years of policy by recognizing the annexation, and Biden upheld that. So Biden actually took a more hardline position than Ronald Reagan, because Reagan administration recognized what Israel was doing was illegal, but Biden's position, oh, that's fine, you can do that. You can take over land you seized by military force, no problem. Same with Western Sahara and Morocco. But since the Assad regime was overthrown, Israel has moved even further into Syria, taking over the entire what was formerly a demilitarized zone, and they are setting up bases there. How long term is hard to say, but you're seeing Israelis talking about let's build a ski resort on Mount Hermon, and there's but again the it's pretty clear that Biden, despite his lip service to a rules-based international order, had no problems with our allies violating that principle. But Trump doesn't even pretend to support a rules-based international order. It's for him, anything goes. If you have the power, you can do whatever the hell you want. And again, in certain ways, this gives us more of an opening than the hypocritical liberal spouting platitudes while pursuing policies which have the same result to the more overt racist imperialist like Trump.
Okay, the floor is open. If there's any other comments, issues to raise.
Yeah, again, I would encourage people to look at, check out my, email me if you want to be on my email list. I'm also, putting in the address for my website. You're certainly welcome to peruse as well.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yes. Again, thank you for all your insights. It seems that despite this impression, because of the military aggression of the IDF and the general triumphalism of this Netanyahu regime, that Israel is facing a lot of very serious contradictions in their economy right now. People are leaving. And I guess the question is how much the Trump administration how far they'll go, despite their kind of nationalistic, let's close the borders to everybody, to prop them up. And even the IDF, I think, has had, serious problems in terms of maintaining their numbers, and they have not been able, to maintain a presence, for example, in Lebanon. And so do you think this is going to play some role in terms of how things unfold in Palestine, Israel?
Yeah, I mean, Israel can only get away with the stuff that it does because they can. I mean, I don't think Israelis are uniquely worse than any other people. If any country in a conflict-ridden region that had concerns about security was given the blank check of a superpower, then they can do whatever they want, get all the arms they want, get all the money they want, get protection for the United Nations and any consequences or things like that. They probably do the same thing. But a lot of Israelis are finding that not sustainable. A lot of Israelis are leaving. The problem, though, is that because Israel now knows they can go as far to the right as they want, they'll still get U.S. support. So there are no consequences to how far to the right they go. A lot of Israelis in the middle who would vote left if they knew there were consequences, but vote right when they believe there aren't any, are voting right. Not to mention the demographics. The Jewish fundamentalist, ultra-nationalist, right-wing families have lots of children. The more left-leaning, secular Israeli families tend to have smaller families, and I swear half the Israelis I know who tend to be on the left, of course, have at least one child living in Europe or the United States now because they're getting out. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is not going to last. I mean, Hamas's horrific attack of a year and a half ago, happened just after Netanyahu said we can ignore the Palestinians. And that we have nothing to lose. We got them under control. Let's just not, don't worry about it. And Hamas said, yeah, you can't ignore us.
Laura.
Yeah, my question has to do with the lists that the U.S. keeps, and so it's beyond the Middle East, but the state sponsors of terrorism and the sanctions that the U.S. puts on, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, the sanctions are Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And state sponsor of terrorism, I think, are the same countries. What what do you think about, what opinions do you have about those in terms of the, there's
I mean, I don't. I mean,
authoritarian and human rights and
yeah. I
all.
mean, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, frankly, all have pretty poor human rights records. But that's not why the U.S. is sanctioning them. I mean, we have plenty of countries that have even worse human rights records that we trade with. We provide them arms. We provide them support. So and also if you are going to use sanctions against a country for human rights abuses or whatever, you need to target them, and to go after the bad guys, not just to get the whole population to suffer, which is the way the United States tends to deal with sanctions, particularly towards those three countries.
Well, I think also in terms of the sanctions, what they're actually also referred to as unilateral coercive measures, which are prohibited by the United Nations.
Exactly. Well, exactly. Except here's the thing or that's why the sanctions on Cuba it comes up to the General Assembly every year, and only I mean literally only dissenting votes in the 193 member General Assembly is United States and Israel.
Right.
So yeah. Yeah, these are these are clearly illegal. Though again, the U.S. insists insist our national security is at stake if we don't do otherwise. Which again, I don't think anybody, even the biggest critics of those governments, would say is totally silly.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I thank you. Unless there are any pressing questions, I'm fine about ending here. But again, please check out my website and again, give me an email if you would like to be on my email list, and which I send out my articles once or twice a month. I don't send anything else, just my articles and interviews, including including when this is posted on YouTube. I'll include that link in my next group email.